So, defining your customer. As you will be aware, we ask you to define your customer in your self-defined brief, and it probably won't be the first time you've been asked to design for a particular consumer in mind. But I just wanted to recap on some of the theory and vocabulary of consumer research, and then ask you to do what I hope will be a useful exercise to help you bring your particular customer or your audience into view. I want you to think of this as a creative process, and it should be as useful for those who want to produce a commercial collection, as well as those who want to create something more experimental and conceptual. But firstly, consumer research involves a process of dividing consumers into groups with shared characteristics. And I will quickly go through these to hopefully spur on your process of imagining the person who's going to be wearing and using your collection. And your consumer is, in a sense, a creative guide or a muse, or that's how I would like you to use them. They should inspire you. And that's why I think it's a good idea to not make your consumer too generic. Remember, there's no such thing as an average person. But in the process of identifying someone who's really specific, there are bound to be others who also connect with that person. And I often think that the stronger and more specific the focus, the stronger the connection between the potential consumer and the product. So I think it's worth also reflecting on your own experience, though those moments where you see something which you feel was made just for you. Or is that something you very rarely do? Do you feel that you are actually not sufficiently acknowledged as a consumer in contemporary fashion? So in order to do that, it's vital that designers think very carefully about who they are talking to. Constantly asking this imaginary person, or real one if that's relevant, is this right? Does this work? Is this what you've always wanted? Does it fit your body? Does it fit your life? But before we get on with the task of articulating your consumer, I'm going to quickly go through some of the kinds of variables that marketers use to help them understand who their consumers are and how to target them effectively. So, firstly, we think about demographic variables. So this is quite an obvious one. Very typically, fashion is focused on targeting different age groups. And there are obviously very good reasons for this, as the type of clothing a 2-year-old would wear would differ drastically to someone who is, let's say, 20. But it's important not to fall into some of the potential pitfalls of this as well. The vast majority of fashion targets young women aged between about 18 to 25, and that's a very crowded, if lucrative, market. But people want great clothes also at other ages, so that is something to think about. So thinking about customers in terms of generations is also quite popular, particularly the recent decades. And the idea of those who are born and have grown up at a similar time having developed some kind of shared values and preferences as a result. So, we can think about the baby boomers historically, but also more recently, millennials, Generation X, or currently the buzz is around, Gen Z. So is your customer a kind of individualist millennial or a woke Gen Z person? I think this way of thinking can be quite reductive, but there is some relevance to it. And you decide what you think. But clearly these are phrases that are used a lot in industry. And as you will also be aware, the fashion industry has always been organised along these very binary gender lines. And this is now changing, which means gender identity is not necessarily as important, or might be important in different ways than how it's been, in the past and conventionally. So maybe gender isn't quite as important at this moment in time in terms of how we choose our clothing as maybe it was even just a decade ago. Life stage as well can be an important factor. Within the next 5 years, you will probably find that the clothes you wear will change as you go from having a kind of student identity to maybe a young professional. And someone who's 25, let's say with a young child, might have more in common with someone who is 35 in the same situation than maybe with someone their own age, because of the stage you're at in your life. Occupation is obviously important, as someone who's a corporate lawyer will be expected to dress very differently to someone who's, let's say, an architect. And these variables may be important in different circumstances. So think about how they may be relevant or maybe less relevant to your consumer. And finally, income is an obvious one that will shape what your consumer is able to buy and spend on clothing. Okay, so moving on to geographic variables. So where you live will make a huge difference to how you dress. So both on a practical level, but also cultural. So if you lived or visited other countries, you probably would have noticed that often, it can be quite subtle or distinct, but people dress differently. And that can be because of climate and seasonal variables, but also because practices of dressing, are shared and are cultural. But even within a country, there will be huge differences. So most obviously they are between, the big cities or rural areas, but also those areas in between. So size of cities and towns matter, as well as maybe the type of home you live in. So, intertwined with all of this is what is referred to in marketing theory as psychographic and behavioural variables. I think in sociology you probably just call it, identity. But under this heading, we include things like lifestyle, which has an obvious impact on the clothes we wear. But also aspirations. So they might be wearing an ASOS trench coat, but aspire to one day buy a Burberry one. Self-image will be, how do they see themselves? What sort of person are they? Are they the kind of person who wears a Burberry trench coat? Classic, conservatively stylish, quality conscious, and maybe status conscious, for example. Value perception within marketing theory refers to what consumers consider to be of value to them. So actually quite a subjective thing. So for example, a customer may perceive a high cost of a Burberry trench to be an indicator of high quality and longevity, but may in the end decide to compromise on these values instead buy an ASOS version at 1/10 of the cost. So essentially valued perception is a complex issue, but think about what your consumer would perceive as value. What's valuable to them in a garment. And although you may not intend on actually selling your collection, it's also worth considering purchasing decisions and shopping habits. Are they impulse buyers or careful planners or a bit of both? What motivates them to acquire new garments? Practical needs, emotional needs? Do they have a specific event to attend? Do they buy into trends or do they avoid trends? And this also links to attitudes and opinions, although it's also worth thinking about what we say and what we do not always correlate. But what is their moral compass and where is it directed? What's important to them? So some may be very directly linked to fashion consumption, such as animal welfare, sustainability, that a garment is ethically produced, but also more widely. So what's important to them, in life generally. Is it friendships, career, just having fun, traveling, gender equality, exercise, finding love? Are they spiritual or religious? All these things that kind of make up and create a sense of, our priorities. And finally, it's worth considering what is referred to as usage and benefit variables. So I've referred to these before, so some of these are kind of repeating themselves a little bit, but this is more explicitly how and why a consumer will purchase a product, how they will use it, but also how they might dispose of it. I think this is very important to consider in the fashion design process. So firstly, what benefits will the consumer want from the product? So the Burberry trench may be useful in keeping dry in wet and windy weather, but there are many products out there that could do this, probably even more effectively. So there are probably other benefits as well. So that might be status, fashionability, longevity. Might be other benefits that the consumer might seek. Usage rates refers to how often a garment is expected to be worn, which will vary drastically from garment to garment, and will also significantly kind of motivate or shape the decision, and also value perception. So a wedding dress today, for example, is typically only worn once, but more savvy brides-to-be may look for something which can be worn again or resold, providing additional benefits. So personally, I'm all about cost per wear, so I will spend a lot more on coats, for example, than anything else, because I know I'll get a lot of wear out of them. So I will probably spend about 5 times as much on a coat as pretty much any other garment type. Volume of purchases, obviously how often and how much of a product consumers will buy. So typically young women buy a high volume of low cost garments, whereas older consumers will tend towards fewer maybe, but higher value purchases. But obviously there'll be lots of exceptions to this, so don't feel constrained by the average and what is typical, because there's lots of people who would not necessarily conform to that. Brand loyalty. Consumers vary greatly in how loyal they are towards brands, towards the brands they buy. So some may be more difficult to reach than others, as you will need to kind of convert them or change their loyalties. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but loyalty involves a range of aspects of, ranging from identification with the brand's ethos, shopping habits, practicalities, perceived value, etc., etc. And finally, end of use. What will happen to the product after it's no longer used? Will the consumer dispose of it, gift it, resell it? Will it become a treasured heirloom or just trash? Increasingly, consumers are considering the end of use of the things they buy. Is it going to have resale value? Can it be recycled or repurposed? Can it be passed on to new users? So increasingly we're seeing brands actually deliberately building end-use benefits into their products as kind of added value. Okay, so I have tried to balance giving you an introduction to some of the marketing theory and vocabulary around consumer behaviour, but also ideas that can be useful for you in the process of identifying a really compelling and inspiring consumer who seems relevant to you. I think the process here is not dissimilar to how a writer would construct a character for a story. And I think it's worth thinking of characters from TV, film or literature that have stayed with you. What made them seem real and what made them seem interesting. You could base your consumer on a fictional character or around someone you know, or a mix of both. And to do this, I think a pen portrait is a really useful exercise. So creating a pen portrait is a profile of a character who is representative of your target market group. And it may seem counterintuitive to make it so specific, but it's only through really creating something very detailed, a very detailed specific character, that I think a consumer can become real to you and thereby useful. So to give you an idea, I've done one very quickly, and I think it's perhaps a bit cliched, because I didn't spend much time on it. But I'm going to read it out, and increasingly, as I read it out as well, I get a sense of what feels right or not, and you can go about amending it as you see fit. And I think there's a mix here of kind of using your instinct, experience, as well as consumer research. So very well worth actually putting in some research into this, and this can be primary or secondary. Okay, so I found this random image on Google, and I'm going to create a little pen portrait around it just to demonstrate to you. So what I want you to do now is download the pen portrait questionnaire from Blackboard to create your own. Okay, so I'm making up a name for her. I'm calling her Naomi, and she is 38. She identifies as a gay woman, and she lives in Brighton. And she has relocated to Brighton from London, as the image would kind of indicate. She has become a parent. She works in arts management, and her annual income is around £50,000. She has an MA then in arts management. So education is obviously important because it gives you a sense of their kind of achievements, but also maybe priorities. Relationship status, I think she's with a long-term partner, but they are planning to marry now that they've established a family. Her ideal weekend is spent going on gallery visits, having brunch, maybe going to the theatre or concerts or gigs. You get the idea. Maybe this is also changing now as she's got a family. Maybe her new ideal is slightly different, or maybe this is what she actually would like to do, whereas in reality her weekends does not involve too many gallery visits or brunches with friends, and instead spending time in the playground or changing nappies, or just watching TV. But her ideal evening is spent relaxing with a partner, maybe doing a yoga class. She's got a cat that she's called Pankhurst, obviously named after suffragettes. So you get a sense here of me building a kind of person, even if I've spent a whole 5 minutes on this. And you can spend more, and you kind of get, you sort of start to realise that, that doesn't quite fit. So her preferred mode of transport is walking, I think. Favourite colour, ruby red. I'm not sure if that's actually right. I think it might be like a more kind of oxblood red. Not sure. Favourite film, I put Heathers down, but now I'm thinking she might be a little bit too young for Heathers. It's kind of like cult 80s film. Favourite TV shows, I think she likes something with strong characters, something with a bit of artistic merit, but also entertaining. Blah blah blah. You get a sense. I'm not going to go through these because they go a bit boring, but this is what I want you to do with your pen portrait. So yeah, again, these I haven't filled in, but there's a long list here. But I hope you're going to enjoy filling it out, and think of it really as creating a character, someone who is going to inspire you. Okay.